Everything changes. Nothing lasts forever. But what if some things could be reborn? The wind howled through the mountaintop, whispering through the trees like an old soul telling forgotten stories. The sky, tinged with the golden hues of sunset, stretched endlessly, mirroring the vast emptiness in his heart. Master Anlong stood at the edge of the cliff, his gaze lost in the distant horizon. For over 40 years he had lived in solitude, retreating from the world, surrendering himself to the quiet rhythm of meditation and the slow passage of time. He had abandoned all worldly ties, believing that detachment was the key to peace. But peace, as he had come to realize, was not merely the absence of attachment. It was something else entirely, something he had yet to understand. Then came the letter. It arrived with the morning mist, slipped beneath the wooden door of his humble dwelling. The parchment was old, the ink slightly faded, yet the words burned into his mind as if they had been etched onto his very soul. The house is dying. Nothing more, no name, no explanation, but he knew exactly what it meant. The house, his childhood home. The place where he had once laughed, once cried, once dreamed of a future that never came to be. A house that had stood for generations, sheltering stories, memories, and echoes of those who had come before. It had been strong once, sturdy and full of life. Now it was fading like a candle in the wind, forgotten and abandoned. He closed his eyes. He had spent a lifetime letting go of attachments, of desires, of the past. He had trained himself to silence the voice that called him, back to things that no longer existed. And yet in that moment something stirred, a whisper in the wind. A memory refusing to be buried. He had believed himself to be free, but could a man ever truly be free from the roots that shaped him? The road back was longer than he remembered. The world had changed in his absence. Cities had grown taller, the air heavier with the hum of restless energy. Streets once familiar were now foreign landscapes, filled with strangers who had no memory of the past he carried. He walked slowly, each step a quiet conversation with the ghosts of a life he had left behind. When he finally arrived, he hesitated. The house was worse than he had imagined. The once majestic roof sagged like an old man's shoulders, burdened by the weight of time. Vines crawled up the walls, weaving through cracks like nature itself had begun reclaiming it. The wooden doors, once polished to a fine sheen, were now splintered and weather-worn. The windows, hollow and empty, reflected nothing but the fading light of the day. It was a ruin, a relic, a whisper of what it once had been, and yet he stepped forward, placing a hand against the cold stone wall. Beneath the decay, beneath the layers of dust and neglect, something still remained. A heartbeat, a breath, a quiet resilience, waiting to be acknowledged. The past was still here, buried under time, longing to be unearthed. He stood there for what felt like hours, listening. To the silence, to the echoes of laughter that still lingered in the air, to the quiet plea of a place that had not yet given up. Could something so broken ever be whole again? The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the worn, wooden floor. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his decision clear. This was not just about a house, this was about something deeper. Time had worn it down. Just as it had worn him down, but even the most shattered things could be mended. He took a deep breath. And for the first time in 40 years, he stepped inside. Have you ever felt the weight of time? Have you ever stood before something you once loved and wondered if it could ever be restored? Master Anlong's journey is not just about a house. It is about all of us, about the past we carry, about the things we think we have lost. But perhaps nothing is ever truly lost. The wooden floor groaned beneath his feet as he stepped inside. Dust swirled in the dying light, disturbed by his presence, as if the house itself had drawn in a breath after years of silence. Master Anlong stood still, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, forgotten stories, and time itself. The walls, once polished and warm, were now cloaked in layers of dust and cobwebs. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its frame rusted, the glass smudged. Yet it remained, much like the house, waiting in quiet resilience. He moved forward slowly, his fingertips grazing the surface of a wooden table, feeling the rough grain beneath his skin. This was where his father had once sat, hunched over his calligraphy, the steady brushstrokes filling the silence with meaning. He could almost hear it now, the gentle rasp of the inked brush against parchment, the patient exhale of a man lost in his craft. The past had not left. It lived within these walls, in the spaces between decay, in the absence of voices that had once filled the air. He turned toward the hearth where the last fire had long since turned to ash. The stones were cold now, their warmth stolen by time, but as he knelt before them, pressing his palm against the surface, he could still remember the heat. He saw himself as a boy, curled beside the flickering flames on a winter's night, listening to his mother hum an old tune, a song of distant lands and gentle goodbyes. The melody was gone now, but its echoes remained, faint yet enduring, like whispers carried by the wind. He walked further in, past the collapsed bookshelves and broken chairs, toward a door left slightly ajar. His old room. The paper walls were torn, the wooden beams exposed like brittle bones. The futon he had once slept on was buried beneath fallen plaster, its edges peeking out like a memory struggling to resurface. He hesitated before stepping inside, feeling the weight of years pressing against him. Kneeling, he reached beneath the broken floorboards, his hands seeking something he was no longer sure existed. And then his fingers met paper, fragile, worn, but still intact. Gently he pulled it out, unfolding the delicate sheet, revealing the inked characters from a life he had tried to leave behind. Her poem written in the careful strokes of a younger self, a boy who had not yet learned the art of letting go. Even the river forgets its shape, but never the path it flows. He traced the letters with his fingertips, feeling the quiet wisdom of his own past self. Time had tried to erase this, to bury it beneath the weight of neglect, yet here it was, surviving despite everything. A gust of wind pushed through the cracks in the walls, stirring the dust into golden spirals. The house was speaking, urging him to remember. It was not just wood and stone, not merely a structure doomed to collapse. It was a witness, a vessel of memory, a place where life had once thrived and could thrive again. Rising to his feet, he looked around, truly seeing it for the first time. Yes, the house was broken. Yes, it had been abandoned, but it was not beyond saving. He had spent his life meditating on impermanence, accepting the ebb and flow of existence, yet standing here, surrounded by the remains of what once was, he realized something he had long overlooked. Impermanence was not merely about loss. It was also about renewal, about honoring what was while making space for what could be. His fingers tightened around the old poem as he turned toward the door, stepping back into the main hall. The dust still floated in the air, the silence still heavy, but something had shifted. The house had been waiting, and now, for the first time in decades, someone had returned to listen. At dawn, Master Anlong stood in the courtyard, watching the first light of morning spill over the crumbling walls. The house, once dignified and proud, stood like an old man weathered by time, silent, waiting. It had endured storms, neglect, and years of solitude. Now it was time to begin again. He took a slow breath, steadying himself for what lay ahead. Rebuilding was never just about restoring structure. It was about understanding what must be kept, what must be let go, and what must be transformed. Before anything new could take shape, the old had to be broken down. The first swing of the hammer came with a sharp crack as wood splintered beneath the force. Dust erupted into the air, catching the light in golden streaks. And Long felt the weight of the past in every strike, each impact a reminder of time's inevitable passage. The walls had held so many memories, but they had also become weak, unable to shelter anything but echoes of what once was. There was something deeply humbling about destruction. It was easy to see ruin as failure, to mistake collapse for loss. But standing amidst the falling beams and shattered fragments of his childhood, and Long understood a truth he had carried within him all along. Destruction was not the end. It was the beginning. A group of villagers arrived by midday, drawn by curiosity, perhaps by the sight of an old man tearing down what others would have left to rot. Some shook their heads, muttering that the house was beyond saving. Others watched in silence, uncertain whether to admire or pity him. One man, younger than the rest, stepped forward. "This house has been empty for decades," he said. "Why not build something new?" And Long paused, dust settling in his hair and robes. He studied the man for a moment before answering. "New does not always mean better," he said. "Sometimes what is old carries something worth saving." The man hesitated, then picked up a wooden beam, dragging it to the side. One by one, the others followed. Without another word, they joined in the work. The afternoon was filled with the rhythm of labor, the creak of wood, the clang of tools, the murmurs of effort and exhaustion. Some walls had to be taken down completely, their foundations too weak to hold anything upright. Others were stripped bare, revealing the raw framework beneath. The courtyard, once overgrown with weeds, was slowly cleared, its stone path uncovered one step at a time. Among the debris and long-discovered remnants of the past, an old ceramic bowl, chipped but intact, a wooden comb his mother once used, a rusted bell from the entrance gate. He set them aside carefully, as if handling memories made tangible. By evening the house stood partially dismantled, its skeleton exposed to the open air. The villagers sat around, wiping sweat from their brows, their hands streaked with dust. Some had come only to watch but had stayed to help, and Long did not thank them outright. He simply poured tea, passing each of them a cup, acknowledging their presence in the quiet way of a man who understood gratitude was not always spoken. As night fell, he looked at what remained, a structure stripped to its essence, standing not as a relic of the past but as a foundation for the future. It would not be easy. The work ahead was long, uncertain, but something within him felt lighter, as if, in tearing down the house, he had also begun to rebuild a part of himself. Impermanence had always been his lesson, but now for the first time he was not merely teaching it, he was living it. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh timber. The house, once stripped down to its bare bones, now stood like a quiet promise, a space waiting to be filled, a life waiting to be renewed. Master An Long ran his fingers over the smooth grain of a freshly cut wooden beam, feeling the pulse of time within it. This was not just about rebuilding walls, it was about honoring the past while shaping the future. The first step was the foundation. The original stones, worn by years of neglect, had been unearthed and carefully inspected. Some were cracked, beyond use, but others still held their strength. He chose these wisely, setting them back into place with deliberate care. As he worked, the villagers who had helped tear down the old house returned, some bringing tools, others carrying materials, salvaged from their own homes. They did not ask for payment, nor did he offer it. The work itself was the exchange, a silent understanding that rebuilding was not merely an act of construction, but of connection. The wood used for the new frame came from trees that had stood on the land for generations, their trunks shaped by wind and time, and Long oversaw each piece, ensuring that nothing was wasted. The beams were measured and cut by hand, their edges sanded smooth. He worked alongside the villagers, his movements steady and patient, as if he were guiding the house back to life rather than forcing it into existence. As the framework took shape, he turned his attention to the heart of the home, the hearth. In the old days, it had been the center of warmth, the place where his mother had brewed tea, where conversations lingered long into the night. The original stones had been removed, cleaned, and repositioned, their surfaces still bearing the imprint of past flames. When the first fire was lit, the glow flickered against the walls, casting shadows that danced like echoes of forgotten stories. One evening, as he sat near the unfinished walls, a young boy approached. The child had watched the construction from a distance for days but had never spoken. Now he held something in his small hands, a shard of blue ceramic, the fragment of an old bowl. "This was buried near the house," the boy said. "Is it broken forever?" And Long took the piece gently, examining its smooth edges. The crack that split it was deep, but the colors still shone beneath the dust. "Not forever," he said. "Some things can be mended." The next morning, he gathered the broken fragments that had been set aside during the clearing process, bits of pottery, old wooden carvings, even a rusted iron bell. He showed the villagers how to repair them, using an ancient technique of binding the cracks, with gold-laced lacquer, not to hide the damage but to make it part of the object's history. It was slow, delicate work, but as they pieced together the broken things, something shifted. They were not just fixing objects, they were honoring them. The house, too, was taking shape in this way, its scars not erased, but embraced. The wood used for the door still bore the marks of age. The floorboards creaked softly as if whispering old secrets. In the main hall, Anne Long hung a single bell near the entrance, its tone low and resonant. When the wind passed through, it sang, carrying the voice of the house beyond its walls. The final touch was the garden. Where weeds had once choked the courtyard, he planted herbs and flowering vines. Stones were arranged into quiet pathways, leading to a small bench beneath the shade of an ancient tree. This was not just a house. It was a place for reflection, for stillness, for remembering that life, like a house, is always in a state of being built, broken, and built again. When the last tile was placed, and Long stepped back, breathing in the scent of earth and wood, the house was no longer the same, and yet in some way it had never been more itself. He touched the doorframe, feeling its warmth beneath his fingertips. It was steady. It was alive. Impermanence did not mean loss. It meant change. And change, when met with care, could be beautiful. The house stood in the golden light of late afternoon, no longer a ruin but something reborn. Its walls, though new, carried the weight of old stories. Its floors, once buried beneath dust and time, now bore the steady rhythm of footsteps once more. The scent of fresh wood mixed with the earthy fragrance of the garden, where herbs and flowers swayed in the gentle breeze. The house breathed again. Master and Long stood by the entrance, his fingers resting lightly against the wooden frame. It was warm beneath his touch, alive in a way that only something cared for could be. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the space around him. The villagers had gone home, leaving behind the echoes of their laughter, their effort, their hands woven into every corner of this place. It had been a labor of many, not just his own, and in that he found a quiet sense of peace. A small bell, newly polished but aged by time, hung near the doorway. When the wind stirred, its sound drifted through the air, soft, steady, unbroken. It was the same bell that had once marked the passing of days here, ringing in meals, calling loved ones back home. Now it remained as a reminder that nothing was ever truly lost. That evening, he lit a fire in the hearth for the first time in decades. The flames flickered against the stone, casting long shadows across the room. He sat before it, feeling the warmth seep into his skin, much like it had all those years ago. He could almost hear his mother's voice in the crackling embers, the soft hum of an old melody carried in the shifting air. There was a knock at the door. A familiar figure stepped inside. One of the villagers, the young man who had once questioned why the house was worth saving. He held something wrapped in cloth, placing it carefully on the table before unwrapping it. It was an old ceramic bowl, the one the boy had found before, now whole again. The cracks, once deep and jagged, had been filled with gold, each fracture now gleaming softly in the firelight. "You were right," the young man said. "Some things are worth saving." And Long took the bowl in his hands, running his fingers over the golden veins that held it together. It was more beautiful now, not despite its brokenness, but because of it. The two men sat in silence for a long time, drinking tea from the mended bowl, the warmth of it seeping into their palms. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rustling, the leaves carrying the scent of earth and wood smoke through the night air. The house was no longer just a house. It had become something more, a place of renewal, of remembrance, of quiet resilience. It had endured not by resisting change, but by embracing it. Life, he realized, was no different. We spend so much time mourning what is lost, fearing what is broken, resisting the inevitable passage of time. But what if we looked at it differently? What if instead of seeing loss we saw transformation? What if we allowed our fractures to be filled with something even more beautiful? Change is not destruction. It is not an end. It is an invitation to rebuild, to reshape, to reimagine. Like the house, we are all works in progress. We break, we fall apart, but we can also mend. And in doing so, we do not erase what has been, we honor it. As Long sat in the quiet glow of his newly rebuilt home, he understood something he had not before. This was not just about the house. It had never been just about the house. It was about the life he had lived, the choices he had made, the things he had once thought he had left behind. It was about time, about memory, about knowing that even the things we believe are lost can find their way back to us, if only we have the patience to listen. The wind stirred again, brushing against the walls, slipping through the open door like an old friend returning home. The bell chimed once, its sound drifting softly into the night. Nothing was ever truly gone. Everything could be made whole again. If this story has spoken to you, if it has stirred something within you, I invite you to stay a little longer. There are many stories yet to be told, many lessons yet to be shared. Join me on this journey of remembering, of rebuilding, of finding meaning in the spaces between. And if you feel that someone else needs to hear this, share it with them. Because sometimes all it takes is a single story to remind us that even in our most broken moments, there is always a way forward.